In 1979, a group of students occupied the U.S. Embassy in Iran. Tat Stewart was a pastor living in Tehran at the time, and that day he and his wife went to church just like normal.
On the way home, I said to my wife, let's drive by the American Embassy and see what's going on. And she said, well, why not? When we got to the street where we would turn on to where the embassy was, the streets were all blocked off. So it was obvious that there was something happening. So we decided to lower our heads and just go home. And so then we began to get worried because, were they going to be looking for us? And other members of my church began to call me and say, Tat, should we be concerned? I said, well, I think you should stay home for a while.
That event is one chapter in the Iranian Revolution, a revolution that would affect Tat Stewart's family and church in significant ways. And that revolution still affects gospel work in Iran to this day.
Jesus never promised his followers an easy path. In fact, he told his disciples that the world would hate them. He sent them out as sheep among wolves. Jesus' words came true in the life of the apostles, and they're still coming true today in the lives of his followers around the world. Join host Todd Nettleton as we hear their inspiring stories and learn how we can help. Right now on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.
Welcome again to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio. Today's episode is going to be a dramatic one, including stories of government intrigue and historical events. But it will also remind us, no matter what the circumstances, God is in control. My name is Todd Nettleton. I am connected online with Tat Stewart. He was the last pastor of the Community Church of Tehran inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. Tat, welcome to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio.
Hey, Todd, it's great to be with you. Been looking forward to having this conversation with you.
I have been looking forward to it as well. We're going to go back in a few minutes to kind of get some background, but first I want to kind of start out right in the middle of the story. 5 months after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, you moved to Tehran. How did God call you to Iran? Why did you think, even though they're in the middle of a revolution, this is where I should take my family, this is where I should go? How did that come about?
Well, a lot of people thought we were crazy, that's for sure. But let's start back here. My wife and I both grew up in Iran. My wife was born in Iran. And so when I finished seminary, I thought, well, I have a responsibility to the Lord to see if there's a way that I could go back to Iran. And that was before the revolution. So I wrote the pastor of the Community Church of Tehran and said, could I come and do youth work for you or be on your staff? And he wrote back and said, we don't have a budget for that. And so I thought, phew, I've fulfilled my obligation to go to Iran. Now I can move on with my life. And so I accepted a call to a small church in New Jersey. And after the 6th year of ministry, I was on a youth conference and we received a letter. My wife opened the letter, and it was an invitation from the Evangelical Church of Iran, the church that Presbyterians had founded and had been registered since 1860 in Iran. And it invited us to come to pastor St. Christopher's Church in Abadan, Iran, which was a dual language congregation. And my wife, before that, had pretty much indicated she'd been to Iran, she'd done that. She wasn't exactly excited about going back with 2 children, ages 6 and 4. And so when she called me at the conference, she said, Tat, are you sitting down? And I thought, oh boy, she's had a car accident. Something horrible's happened. And she said, we've received this letter and I'm ready to go. Right then I knew that was God's call, because I had talked to the Lord and I said, Lord, I'm not taking my wife anywhere that she doesn't feel called to, because that's just not good for life and the marriage. So we applied to the mission board. And of course, that took a time. And after I resigned from the church, the revolution came to bloom, and we couldn't go. So for 6 months, we just kind of treaded water in some missionary housing in Ventnor, New Jersey. And then the former pastor and others in Iran went to the offices of one of the Ayatollahs, Ayatollah Talabani, who later they believed actually was murdered. He was the more liberal, open-minded one, and the question was posed to him: would the new regime tolerate a church for expatriates, for American Christians, European Christians? And he said, of course. And so he sent a telex to the then embassy in Washington, D.C., Iranian embassy. We went and we got our visas. And so at that point, there wasn't, the Islamic government hadn't really come into fruition. There were still political, diplomatic relationships with Iran. And so we flew and arrived in Iran in July of 1979, just 5 months after Ayatollah Khomeini had come flying in on his Air France jumbo jet.
Now, obviously, it was a country you were familiar with. It's a country that you grew up in, but also it's a country that has just had this Islamic Revolution. How much fear did you have about taking that ministry job?
Well, I think because of our sort of impressions from our youth, we always saw the Iranians as hospitable and kind people, and so I don't think we had too much fear till we got off the plane in Tehran, and we were surrounded by what looked like somebody's junior high group in camouflage uniforms, all carrying automatic machine guns and scowling at us. That's when the fear began to really take over. But as we came into the airport and we were waiting for our luggage, all of the guys that worked in the luggage were from Azerbaijan. The labor class in Iran tends to be from the province of Azerbaijan. And since I grew up in Tabriz, Azerbaijan, and I knew their language, and so when I started talking to them in Azeri Turkish, they all gathered around me and said, "Our brother has come home." And so I got this wonderful welcome from the luggage handlers. And then as we came through customs, we had no problem because we had the multiple entry work permit visas from the Islamic Republic of Iran. And there we were met by representatives of the Iranian church who took us to a really nice hotel, and we had breakfast, and everything seemed pretty good. Tehran was normal until at dusk, and then after dark is when the shooting started and a lot of scrimmages in the city. And so we basically stayed home during the day and certainly at night.
Now, did you ever have any more contact with the Ayatollah who said, yes, we would welcome a pastor? Did you ever have any relationship or any contact with him, or that's just how God opened that door?
Just how God opened that door. And while we were there, he passed away. And the talk on the street was that because he was not conforming to Ayatollah Khomeini's vision of the future, that he was poisoned. But he was such a popular guy that about 2 or 3 days, Tehran completely shut down. The streets were filled with mourners, and we just kind of laid low. We learned to lay low a lot during those days.
Okay, so we kind of jumped in the middle of the story, but I want to go back. As you mentioned, you had lived in Iran as a young boy. How did that happen?
Well, I think I have to go back to why my father and mother felt called to Iran, because I think it's a significant story. When my father was born, he was one of twins, and the first one was stillborn, and they weren't sure he was going to live. He was about a month premature. And they brought in a relative who was a godly man, and he prayed this prayer over my father: "Lord, if you spare this child, we consecrate him to Afghanistan." Now, I don't know how many prayers like that God ever hears, and I don't know if this man even knew where Afghanistan was in 1919, but that's where the Lord led him to pray. And so my father grew up with a passion for Afghanistan, not even knowing how it was prayed over. And so I found in the family archives, scrapbooks of him when he was a young man collecting pictures from Afghanistan. So after World War II, when he'd been a captain in the army, a doctor, and got married, they went to the mission board and said, "We want to go to Afghanistan." And they laughed and said, "Afghanistan does not accept any Christian visas, any Christian missionaries, but we have openings in Iran." And so my dad said, "Well, it's next to Afghanistan. I'll take Iran." And so in 1947, they arrived in Tabriz after about a month's journey to get there. And I was a little under 2 years old when I made my entree into Iran.
Did you basically learn the language and learn English almost simultaneously?
Absolutely. What people forget is kids learn the language of the people they relate to.
Uh-huh.
And so actually I learned Armenian, which I've mostly forgotten, and I learned Azerbaijan Turkish, and I learned English because I had to deal with people that spoke those languages constantly around me. And so by God's grace, I learned the Azeri language without any accent, learned it as just the way kids learn it. And later, my parents were transferred to Mashhad over near the Afghan border. And there, at age about 12, I started learning Farsi. And so, as God would have it, I learned two of these languages of Iran as a child, the same way basically Iranians learn it.
When you're talking to someone, do you pull up a word in a different language?
Oh yeah, I want to because we have, as you know, we have a lot of Iranian Christians that are from that are Armenian, and when they get together, they start speaking Armenian. So I have to tell them, I said, now you got to realize I understand a lot of what you're saying, so be careful what you say. And I'll drop a few phrases here and there. I'm not fluent in Armenian, but the language seems very familiar to me, and I probably could learn more if I had to. But I have stayed fluent in Azeri Turkish, which is also spoken in the Republic of Azerbaijan. And I've taken mission trips up into that country, and right away they say, "Oh, you must be from Iran," because we have more Persian words in our Azeri, and they have more Russian words in their Azeri.
Ah, interesting. So you've talked about the road that your parents took and the long journey to even get there and then get on the ground and get established. What did you learn from their example, or what did you see in their example that you've tried to put into practice in your own ministry and in your own life?
Well, one thing that I think is important to note is that children pick up the attitude of their parents. And what I learned is that my mother and father really loved Iranians. Now, a lot of missionaries didn't because there's a big cultural gap. There's a lot of times where there's misunderstanding. And my mother not only loved Iranians, but she loved to witness to them. She started a ministry of teaching English to university students in Tabriz for free, as long as the textbook could be the Gospel of Mark. And so I think she probably went through the Gospel of Mark with nearly 400 or 500 students over the course of her time there, because she'd have 2 or 3 at a time, and they'd come to our house once a week. And my father showed a great kindness and sacrificial spirit towards helping Iranians. And so I grew up thinking, Iran is great. Iranian people are wonderful. I like the food. I like the culture. I like everything. And I think just their love for the Lord and their love for the Iranian people had a great influence on my life. In our home, we were required to go to English church service every Sunday and the Turkish service. So I went to 2 services throughout my whole young life. And in the Turkish service, there were Muslim converts. There weren't many. There were some. I would say 80% of the church were from Armenian and Assyrian Orthodox and Nestorian background that had become Protestants, had become believers in Christ. And I remember there was a whole chain of blind men that would come to church. There was a German ministry that reached out to blind people. And these blind guys all knew the Lord, and they all could sing almost all the hymns by heart. And I remember as a 8 or 9-year-old, I would go and I would help one of them find a seat and go sit by him. And I remember looking into his eyes and seeing this glimmer of joy in his life, even though he couldn't see. And I said to myself, he can see something I can't see. And he was seeing the Lord in some ways. And so I saw in the church Muslims who had become Christians, but I also saw the tremendous crisis because the Armenian Assyrian Christians didn't accept them often as genuine believers, which is understandable. And the Muslim community had rejected them. So I remember my parents agonizing over individuals who felt accepted nowhere, not by the church and rejected by the Muslim community. And that troubled me as a young man. And I felt very bad about that.
Your wife, you said, was born in Iran. What were her parents doing there?
Well, her parents were colleagues. Her father was a medical missionary with the Presbyterian Church as mine, and they were sent to the city of Mashhad, and they arrived in Iran in 1946, I think, and my wife was then born in 1948. So they got married and came to Iran on their honeymoon. Now, here's the interesting story. I met my wife when she was 2 weeks old, and I was 2 years old. Now, most people say, oh, you got to be kidding. But no, there was a first termers conference in Tehran for all the new missionaries that were new on the field. And so Patty's mom, Dr. and Mrs. Murray, Nancy and Tom Murray, they had just had their first little child 2 weeks earlier, but they made the trip to Tehran on a bus, which probably shook the fillings out of their teeth. And my parents were there. And so my mother is invited to see this new baby. And I am taken in with my mother because I'm only 2 years old. And I have absolutely no recollection of this, but we have been told by our parents that this was the first time that we saw each other. And my mother, in what we call prophetic hindsight, says, I knew right then you were going to get married.
It was love at first sight.
Yeah.
So let's jump back now to 1979, and you land in Tehran. What did you expect that your job was going to be when you got there?
Well, because we applied for a visa under the sort of title that I would become the pastor of the community church, and so the Iranian government saw me as a person that was pastoring expatriates, and so our first assignment was to find housing, which we did, and then to begin language study, because after all, we had not been in the country over 15 years, and the Farsi that we spoke was not theological or biblical Farsi. It was what kids talk on the playground. So we began the lessons, and I began leading the services for the community church. I met with the synod of the Iranian Presbyterian Church, and they asked if I would serve as an advisor to the young people. And so along with that, I began to, we have 4 congregations. We had 4 congregations in Tehran. 2 of them were Farsi speaking. One was Armenian speaking, and one was Assyrian speaking. And so I began to move to these young people groups and begin to, with my broken Farsi, start to do some Bible lessons. And I began to disciple 6. I chose 6 young people, and I spent a year discipling those 6 young people.
We're talking today on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Tat Stewart. He is a longtime servant of the Iranian church, both inside the country and outside the country. So what was the attitude within the country as a whole at that time? The Ayatollah had just come back into the country. The Islamic Revolution was happening. Was there a sense of hopefulness? Was there a sense of fear? What was kind of the spirit of the country?
Well, of course, our main contact was within the context of the church, and the church certainly was under great fear. And not only that, people were abandoning the ship. People were leaving Iran as fast as they could. Anybody that had means, anybody that had bank accounts in California or wherever was headed out. The people that we interacted with were basically still filled with rage at America and the Shah. And so anywhere I would go, I would get lectured. Once they found out I was from America, I would have to tolerate lectures about how America and the Shah had destroyed their country. And remember, this is the first months right after the revolution. You won't find that spirit any longer in Iran. But then we were sort of lumped in with part of the problem. And so because of that, we kept a low profile. I mean, even riding taxis and so on. The fact that we could speak the language was a big help. And the fact that we said we loved Iran, and we stayed away from making political assessments, but just sort of listening. So listening.
A lot of listening.
A lot of listening.
So let's talk about November the 4th, 1979, the day the American embassy was taken over. Obviously, it's a day a lot of us have heard stories about. We've maybe watched movies about. You were in Tehran. What was your experience that day?
Well, it was a Sunday. It was a Sunday, and so the downtown church in Tehran, which is called St. Peter's, they did meet there. They did worship on Sunday evening. So we went to that service regularly, and so we didn't even know about it till we arrived at the congregation, and we arrived early to sort of fellowship with people. And they said, "Oh yeah, the students have overrun the American embassy." Now they had overrun the American embassy before in February and the previous year, and the police had come in and squelled it and taken care of it. So we kind of went, oh well, this is this is the way it is, and this will probably be cleared up in a day or two. And so we went to church, and then on the way home, I said to my wife, "Let's drive by the American embassy and see what's going on." And she said, "Well, why not?" So it was on our way home anyhow. But when we got to the street where we would turn on to where the embassy was, the streets were all blocked off. So it was obvious that there was something happening. So we decided to lower our heads and just go home. And so then we began to get worried because, were they going to be looking for us? And other members of my church began to call me and say, "Tat, should we be concerned?" I said, "Well, I think you should stay home for a while." And about 2 or 3 days into it, Ayatollah Khomeini came on the radio and he said, "Please do not harass any American citizens living in the city. Our beef is with the American government." And so that kind of gave us a breather that people were not looking for us. And so we continued on as we had before. However, because there was no American embassy, I found Americans were contacting me for help. And there were some American businessmen that were Christians that didn't know the language. And what people don't realize is that not only did a revolution occur in the country, but every company went through a revolution. The workers took over. And so there were American businesses and companies there that were overrun by the employees. And then, the American advisors and so on were kind of stuck. They didn't have anybody to work with them. So I had to help some find ways to get out of the country, not illegally, but just helping them linguistically to do that. So it was a turbulent time. I would say that the stress level in our lives was pretty high, wondering, what we're going to do. And about week 2, or maybe even 10 days into it, our mission decided that my wife and children should leave the country for a while. And so it was very difficult, but I sent my wife, Patty, and my son and daughter to London because I had a sister that lived in London, and she was willing to house them for a while. And so I spent there a couple of weeks, keep thinking, this is going to blow over. It's going to get better. And of course it didn't. And so I came out of Iran too around Christmas time, and we flew back to the States, spent Christmas in the States. Both of my kids ended up needing surgery for various things, and my wife too. And then we flew back to Iran in February to continue our ministry.
Did you feel, and I'm thinking particularly in the days after November the 4th, did you feel like all Americans are being hunted? Did you feel like, if I step foot out of my doorway, I could be taken hostage, I could be arrested? How much just fear did you have?
Not too much. I think just because we knew the language and we'd made friends with neighbors, and some people said we should have probably had more fear, but we didn't. Occasionally, we would get yelled at, like sort of the Yankee go home kind of thing on the street, and I would answer them in Farsi, and I would say, "Could you repeat that in Farsi for me? I didn't know what you're talking about." And so then we would get phone calls because our phone number, we had an ad in the One English paper for the church, and we would get calls from people. I put this on the day after the takeover. I called the embassy number I had for the charge d'affaires, Bruce Langan, who was the charge d'affaires of the embassy. I called him because I was supposed to have an appointment with him the Monday after the hostage crisis. And one of the students who had run over picked up the phone and pretended to be him. I decided that I would hang up pretty quickly. I didn't know if they could trace the call or whatever. So I hung up pretty quickly. But no, I think the Lord granted us special grace that we were stressed about the future and what would happen and how long we would be able to be there and that sort of thing. But I mean, I went to church, went shopping, did the normal things and I had a car and I drove places. And after we'd been there a year, we tried to renew our residence permits. And at the police station, they said, no, you have to go to the Islamic censorship bureau, or whatever it would be called in Farsi. And so I went there with a lawyer with me, a Jewish Christian man, actually. He was in a part of the Iranian church. I went there and I met with a deputy of this department. And he said, we have instructions from above now that you are to leave the country, and we're giving you 10 days to leave the country. And that was sort of a shock, but I'm standing there thinking, you can't even find an open seat on an airplane for 6 months because everybody that's trying to leave the country, I had all kinds of thoughts how I was going to handle that. But I smiled at the guy. We talked English because he knew English and I didn't talk Farsi. That always makes them more suspicious when you can talk Farsi. So I said, I just want you to know, we've been here not from the American government, but from the Christians of America. And we were just here to serve your people and to share with them about God's love and mercy. And that's why we're here. I just want you to know what we were doing here. He didn't seem impressed at all while I was there, but I shared it anyhow. And then I walk out and I'm sort of stunned. What am I going to do? I don't have an American embassy to go to help. I have nowhere to go. So the Lord said, go to the Swiss embassy. So I went to the Swiss embassy. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting in the ambassador's office, and he said, what can I do? I said, well, here's what happened. The Iranian government's putting me out, and I don't even know how I'm going to get airline tickets. I mean, I have money, but I don't know how to do that. He said, well, what day do you want to go? I said, well, they give me 10 days. I said, we'll leave on the 7th day. That just seemed like a good biblical day to leave. And he picks up the phone and calls Swiss Air and says, you will put this family on the flight to Zurich on that day. And so I went down and got our tickets. So to me, that was a big miracle that happened. And one other thing is we had $50,000 in a dollar account that was left over when the church was like, 600 members. And I said, I do not want that money to go to the Islamic regime of Iran. It's $50,000 back then. Was a lot more than it is today. So I went to the bank and I withdrew $50,000 in rials, which is a pretty handsome pile of money, actually, when you think about it. And I went to all of the Christian ministries, from Campus Crusade, from the Bible Society to the camping ministry. And I gave away $49,000 in one day to all these different ministries. And 2 weeks later, President Carter puts an embargo on any funds going from the American church to the Iranian church. And so that money kept all those ministries going for the next year until they figured out ways for the American people that were supporting Campus Crusade and supporting these other ministries to happen. So I just felt like God just did some amazing things.
Tat Stewart has been telling us some of the dramatic events of 1979 and the Islamic Revolution in Iran. We're reminded from that story, God is in control. There's no world event that takes him by surprise, and he will provide exactly what we need, just like he did in the story that we heard today. The results of the Islamic Revolution are still being felt today, not only inside Iran, but in the surrounding nations as well. But God is also still at work today, calling people to himself inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. You can hear about what God is doing when you explore the archives at vomradio.net. You'll hear interviews with people who serve the Lord inside Iran, including the inside Iranian prisons, who have shared the gospel in dangerous situations and who are broadcasting the truth of the gospel into the Islamic Republic of Iran. You can hear those stories and many others when you visit our website, vomradio.net, or again, simply search for VOM Radio on your favorite podcast app. Tat Stewart has been our guest today. He and his family had a front row seat to the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and 1980. I know you'll be encouraged by the rest of his story, so don't miss that next week right here on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.